So the last time we met, we were discussing one of the extant critical works in Elizabethan literature, which is Sydney's In Defense of Poetry. But we also have Puttenham's Art of English Poesy. Puttenham's Art of English Poesy, which also is a critical work on English literature. So we have other tendencies in Elizabethan art and aesthetics. We have other tendencies in Elizabethan art and aesthetics. So you can call them the characteristics of Elizabethan arts and aesthetics. Some of them are the delight in copia. The delight in copia. That is abundance of words. Abundance of words. Abundance of words. The use of poetic figures. The use of poetic figures. The use of poetic figures. That's tropes. Tropes. All these elements can be found in Shakespeare's work or any work of the Elizabethan era. They use many words. Even if someone wants to say good morning, the people will not say good morning, that they will find other lengthier ways to say it. Poetic figures, the use of tropes, use of language in an imaginative way. The close relation between poetry and rhetoric. The close relations between poetry and rhetoric. Elizabethan works were concerned with differentiation of style. Elizabethan works were concerned with differentiation of styles. For instance, you had the high, you have the middle, you had the low style. The high, the middle, and the low style. The high, the middle, and the low style. The use of allegories, like in the Fairy Queen. The use of allegories. 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 In Elizabethan works, you will find the symbolic relationship in God's creation. In Elizabethan literature, you have the concept of the great chain of being. The great chain of being, which denotes the existence of hierarchical relationships. It denotes the existence of hierarchical what? Relationship. It denotes the existence of hierarchical relationships. The great chain of being. Chain, CHAIN. Everything is related in hierarchical relationship, from the lowest to the highest, from the highest to the lowest. The world was hierarchical and so structured. Let us look at the poetic conventions. The poetic conventions, modes and genres in the Elizabethan era, Elizabethan literature. The poetic conventions, the modes and genres in Elizabethan literature. What were the poetic conventions, the literary conventions of the time? What were the modes of writing and what were the genres? That's what we want to consider now. We can define literary conventions as patterns that have become habitual. We can define literary conventions as patterns that have become habitual, and which can arouse certain expectations in the reader. Which can arouse certain expectations in the reader. So that means that works of art do have the patterns, the literary patterns that we expect when we are reading the work, like sonnet, like epic, and so on and so forth. So the poetic conventions in the Elizabethan period are the pastoral. The poetic conventions in the Elizabethan era are the pastoral, heroic poetry, pastoral poetry, heroic poetry, lyrical poetry, satiric poetry, satire, elegy, that's the elegiac mode, elegy or the elegiac mode, tragedy or the tragic mode, and the comic. These are some of the Elizabethan literary conventions. For poetry, you had the epic. For poetry, you had the epic. You have the tragedy, you have the sonnet, you have the verse epistle, you have the epigram, you have hymn, you have masque, you have funeral elegy, and others. Remember that Aristotle considered tragedy to be the noblest art form. But in Elizabethan literature, epic was the greatest art form. In Elizabethan literature, epic was the greatest art form. In the classical period, tragedy, the drama, was considered the greatest art form. In Elizabethan literature, epic was considered the greatest art form. The lowest was pastoral poetry. The lowest art form was pastoral poetry. The lowest art form was pastoral poetry because it deals with otium. Because it deals with otium, O-T-I-U-M, meaning leisure and humble contentment. Leisure and humble contentment. Because pastoral poetry dealt with leisure, dealt with otium, O-T-I-U-M, which means leisure and humble contentment. Humble contentment and leisure are really associated with pastoral form. We had satirical poems which were considered to be plain in style, to have plain or low style. We had satirical poems which had plain or low style. We had satirical poems which were written in plain or low style. So Elizabethan lyric poems were shorter and were concerned with high praise to God in the form of hymns. Elizabethan lyrical poems were shorter and were concerned with high praises to God in the form of hymns. They also came in the form of odes. They also came in the form of odes. These odes celebrated people and occasions. These odes celebrated people and occasions. So when you talk about Elizabethan lyrical poems, you think of the hymns sung to God, sung to praise God, and the odes that celebrated people and occasions. The odes had exalted tone, elevated language. They were emotionally charged. The odes had exalted tone, elevated language, and they were emotionally charged. They had complex stanzaic structures or forms and were very rich in apostrophes. They had elevated tone, exalted tone, elevated language. They were emotionally charged. They had complex stanzaic structures and they were rich in apostrophes, in the use of apostrophes. Apostrophes in the sense that you address someone who is not present as if the person is present, as apostrophe. An example of ode in the 16th century was the epithalamium. An example of ode in the 16th century was the epithalamium. Epithalamium is spelled E P I T H A L A M I U M. Epithalamium. The epithalamium is a poem that is based on a wedding. It's a wedding song. Epithalamium is a wedding song. It's a wedding poem. Edmund Spencer wrote Epithalamium, as well as other writers. They modeled themselves. The Elizabethan um, old writers modeled themselves after classical old writers like Horace, Catullus, Pindar, and Callimachus. They modeled themselves after Horace, Horace, Catullus, Catullus, Pindar, Pindar, and Callimachus, Callimachus, Callimachus. Sonnet was a lyric genre in the 16th century. The sonnet was a lyric genre in the 16th century. A popular lyrical poem in the 16th century was the sonnet. This convention, the English convention of the sonnet, was borrowed from Francisco Petrarch, who lived between 1304 and 1374. The sonnet form was introduced into England by Thomas Watt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, during the reign of Henry VIII. So the Petrarchan sonnet explores the contrary states of a feeling of a lover. The Petrarchan sonnet explores the contrary states of a feeling a lover experiences as he desires and idolizes an unattainable lady. So the theme of the Petrarchan sonnet is unrequited love. The theme is unrequited love. In the poem, the prisoner sings the lady's beauty, praises the lady's beauty. The prisoner praises the lady's beauty, her power over him, her cruelty to him, his sleeplessness, the fire of his love, and the eyes of her chastity. The pain of absence, the renunciation of love, the eternity and originality of his poem. So these were the conventions, the things that you noted in the Petrarchan sonnets. Then there were tragic poems. An example of a tragic poem was The Complaint. An example of the tragic poem was The Complaint. This form of poetry was developed by Boccaccio, an Italian poet, and had English imitators. Especially in the work The Mirror of Magistrates. The Mirror of Magistrates. The Mirror for Magistrates. The Mirror for Magistrates. So in a typical complaint, you have the ghost of someone who fell from a high place, bemoaning his fate and warning others. In a typical complaint, you have the ghost of someone who fell and died tragically from a high place, bemoaning his fate and warning others. An example is Daniel's Rosamund. An example is Daniel's Rosamond. We also have the heroic epistle as a form of complaint. It was written in a letter form by a woman to the man that wronged her. The heroic epistle was a kind of complaint written in the form of a letter by a woman to the man that wronged her. We also had the mythological erotic mood. Which was a poetry convention in the Elizabethan era. In England, they were practiced as epyllion. There were short mythological narratives like Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and Marlowe's Hero and Linda. Good examples of mythological erotic mood literature are Venus and Adonis by William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe's Hero and Linda. The English writers of mythological erotic poetry imitated Ovid, O-V-I-D, especially his Metamorphoses. So the epic poetry was also practiced in the Elizabethan period. It was the highest form of literature. It was used to discuss the nation and its issues. It was used to glorify the nation and its people, to praise the leadership, to talk about loyalty to the crown, and other virtues like endurance. An example of epic in the Elizabethan period is The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. The subject matter of the epic is war and love. That is, fierce wars and faithful loves shall moralize my song. Spenser invented a stanza to write this poem, and it has come to be known as the Spenserian stanza. It consists of 8 lines of iambic pentameter and has the rhyme scheme ABA, BBC, BC. The Spenserian stanza is made up of 8 lines of iambic pentameter with a rhyme scheme ABA, BBC, BC, and concludes with an Alexandrine. It concludes with an Alexandrine, that is, a line of 12 syllables. Which rhymes with the penultimate line. A line of 12 syllables which rhymes with the penultimate line. It should be noted that Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, introduced blank verse, especially in his translation of Virgil. Later, John Milton will use this blank verse to write Paradise Lost. So you need to note these things. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, introduced the blank verse unrhymed iambic pentameter lines into England in his translation of Virgil, and was later used in Elizabethan tragedy um, by Milton in his epics. It should be noted that the iambic couplet was the most common verse form in the 1560s to the 1570s. The iambic couplet was the most common verse form in the 1560s to the 1570s. Iambic couplet, two-line stanza poem. The first line has 12 syllables and the second line has 14 syllables, known as Poulter's measure. The first line has 12 syllables and the second line has 14 syllables, known as Poulter's measure. Known as Poulter's measure because the poultry man typically gave 12 eggs in the first dozen and 14 in the second. The poultry man usually gave 12 eggs in the first dozen and 14 in the second. Let's just look at drama and the theater in Elizabethan period. Drama and theater in Elizabethan period. If you remember Every Man is a morality play that marked the end of the medieval drama. Every Man is a morality play that marked the end of the medieval drama. So Elizabethan plays and theatre began with interludes. Elizabethan plays and theatre began with interludes. They were performed in the household of John Morton, Morton, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England under Henry VII. They were performed in the house of John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England under Henry VII. At this time, Thomas More served as a page in the house of John Morton. Good examples of interludes are Nature and Lucrece. Nature and Lucrece. Nature, Lucrece, Lucrece. Interludes and morality plays continue to be popular down to to Shakespeare's time. Interludes and morality plays continue to be popular down to Shakespeare's time. It should be noted that it was the classical influences that led to the development of sophisticated drama in the Elizabethan period. Classical influences led to the development of sophisticated drama in the Elizabethan period. The Elizabethan comic plays were influenced by the ancient Plautus and Terence. From Plautus and Terence, the English writers derived elements such as intrigue plots, They borrow elements such as intrigue plot, intrigue, I-N-T-R-I-G-U-E, intrigue plot. They also borrowed a structure of acts and scenes from Plautus and Terence. Plautus is spelled Plautus, Terence Terence. So those were the influences, classical influences on the English plays. The intrigue plot, the structure of acts and scenes, type characters, the use of type characters, the rascally servant, and the cowardly soldier. In Elizabethan time, comedy was seen to be lower than tragedy, just as it was perceived in the classical period. In Elizabethan time, comedy was seen to be lower than tragedy, just as it was perceived in the classical period. The comedy, the comic work, the comic drama was a mixture of prose and verse. Middle class and lower class characters tended to speak prose. Of course, it was generally observed in drama, in Shakespeare's work, that lowly characters use prose, while highly placed characters use verse. Lowly placed characters use prose, highly placed characters use verse. We had romantic comedy, which was developed in Elizabethan time and seen in Shakespeare's As You Like It. So Shakespeare's As You Like It is an example of romantic comedy. We also had domestic comedy, which depicts a domestic situation. We had domestic comedy, which depicts domestic situation. We had city comedy, which has London as its setting, as a city space as its setting. City comedy has London as its setting, and the characters are high-class people. The characters are high-class people. We have humor comedy. We have humor comedy, which is associated with Ben Jonson, comedy of humor. A good example is Every Man in His Humor by Ben Jonson. The work is based on a character type thought to be made by the presence of or predominance of particular fluid or humor in the body, which is responsible for an individual's temperament, like melancholic, choleric, splenetic, and phlegmatic. It was the belief of the time, it was the science of the time, that people's temperament was determined by the dominance of certain fluids in the body, called humor. Of course, we still talk about humor till today, melancholy, phlegmatic, and all of that. Then we also had tragicomedy. We also had tragicomedy. In tragicomedy, evil and problems which seemed destined to end tragically are brought to sudden happy resolution in the work. A good example is Measure for Measure and Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare. The example of tragicomedy is Measure for Measure and Winter's Tale William Shakespeare. Then we also had Elizabethan tragedy. We also had Elizabethan tragedy. It was influenced by Seneca, Seneca. It was influenced by Seneca. And his model of Roman goddess, Fortuna. Fortuna was noted for turning a wheel of fortune, and in the process brought low those who were high, and high those who were low. So the concept of the wheel of fortune goes back to the medieval period. So it's tragedy. The tragedy of the individual depends on where the person is on the wheel of fortune. If the person is up, that means the story is just beginning. But the wheel continues to rotate till the person gets down where he falls. So tragedy was determined by the concept of the wheel of fortune, which was believed to be turned by the goddess Fortuna. As the wheel turns, human destiny changes. Elizabethan drama was modeled after Seneca in terms of violent and bloody plots. Elizabethan drama was modeled after Seneca, Seneca, in terms of violent and bloody plots, resounding rhetorical speeches, the frequent use of ghosts among the cast of the characters, as well as 5-act structure. So this is what you note with most of Shakespeare's plays, because he modeled after Seneca. The use of the presence of violent and bloody plots, resounding rhetorical speeches, the frequent use of ghosts among the casts, as well as the use of 5-act structure. Most of Shakespeare's plays are 5 acts in nature, so he modeled after Seneca. It should be noted that two lawyers by name Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton wrote Gorboduc and Ferrex and Porrex. Gorboduc or Ferrex and Porrex. Sackville and Norton wrote Gorboduc or Ferrex and Porrex. It should be noted that Gorboduc or Ferrex and Porrex first made use of the Senecan models that we have outlined. It was first produced in 1561 at the Inner Temple in a law school and later acted before the Queen. Note that Gorboduc was written in blank verse. Gorboduc was written in blank verse. Gorboduc was written in blank verse. This style would later influence the other writers. Elizabethan drama followed Aristotle's poetics formula. Elizabethan drama followed the principles of Aristotle in the poetics, which stated that the tragic fall should be caused by some error or moral weakness in the protagonist. The tragic fall should be caused by some error or moral weakness in the protagonist. That the fall should involve a fall from eminent success to misery. that the fall should involve a fall from eminent success into misery, marked by reversals and discoveries. By reversal we mean peripatia, and by discovery we mean anagnorisis. That the characters should be persons of high estate, highly placed members of society, and that they should be better than us, better than we. And that the tragedy should evoke pity and fear in the viewers, working at last to achieve a purgation known as catharsis, purging of the emotions. So Shakespeare modeled his tragedies after Aristotle's formula, but violated the three unities and made use of subplot and comic relief. Shakespeare made use of comic relief, made use of subplots, and violated the three unities: time, place, and action. Action, place, and time. The three unities, you remember. Then we have revenge tragedy. We have revenge tragedy. Revenge tragedy. Okay, so we have revenge tragedy in which the wronged protagonist plots revenge and destroys himself in the process. The wronged protagonist plots revenge and destroys himself in the process. A good example is Shakespeare's Hamlet. Shakespeare's Hamlet. The character that is wronged plots revenge, but in the course of plotting the revenge, he destroys himself. A good example is Shakespeare's Hamlet. Then we have villain tragedy. Villain tragedy. Villain tragedy. Villain tragedy. A good example is Shakespeare's Richard III and Macbeth. In this play, the hero is a villain. In villain tragedy, the hero is what? A villain. Okay? So that's why in my notes on Once Upon an Elephant, I see the main character, Ajanaku, as a villain and a hero at the same time, making the play a villain tragedy. There's a play by Christopher Marlowe entitled Dr. Faustus. And the play can be classed as heroic tragedy. The play can be classed as heroic tragedy. Why? Because the hero is larger than life and challenges the limits of human possibilities. The hero is larger than life and challenges the limits of human possibilities. The hero is larger than life and challenges the limits of human possibilities. Another instance of heroic tragedy is Antony and Cleopatra. I hope that text rings a bell. Does it ring a bell? Antony and Cleopatra. It's an example of heroic tragedy, so take note of that. Then we also had masks. Masks were entertainment at court, combining dance, songs, dialogue, spectacle, etc., with extravagant display of costumes and scenery. Masks were court entertainment, as entertainment at the palace, that combined dance, songs, dialogue, spectacle, with extravagant display of costumes and scenery. After that again, in March, you have entertainment, a quad entertainment combining dance, song, dialogue, and spectacle with extravagant display of costumes and scenery. Then we had the history plays. That the history plays. History plays were based on historical events. History plays were based on historical events. History plays were based on historical events. They afforded the readers avenues to reflect on events of national importance or issues that affect the nation. History plays were based on historical events and afforded the readers and the audience an opportunity to reflect on national issues, on politics, and power play, other issues in society. It should be noted that the growth and sophistication of Elizabethan drama was made possible by professional actors, the presence of a theatre and a ready audience, a theatre loving audience. These three factors led to the growth of Elizabethan theatre. Professional actors, the presence of a theatre, a place where plays were rehearsed and performed, and a theatre loving audience. So medieval miracle and mystery plays were acted by amateurs and later by the clergy. Medieval miracle and mystery plays were acted by amateurs and later by the clergy. They were also acted by pages in lords' houses and semi-professional. Pages were personal assistants, PAGE, capital P. These actors were not respectable in status and were often classed among jugglers, acrobats, mountebanks, and other persons of dubious character. So acting profession was not respectable as it is today, where actors are stars to be celebrated. They were often classed as jugglers, acrobats, mountebanks, and other persons of dubious character. In 1545, they were classified as idle rogues and vagabonds, and as such were subject to arrest. In 1545, these actors were classified as idle rogues, those who didn't have anything to do, and vagabonds, those who didn't have anywhere to stay, and as such they could be arrested. So what some actors did was that they attached themselves to a nobleman. They attached themselves to a nobleman, and they wore the badges of these noblemen as their workers, and so they were exempted from arrest or prosecution. And they called themselves after these noblemen, like the Lord Chamberlain's men and the Lord Admiral's men. Shakespeare belonged to the Lord Admiral's men. So what these actors did to survive was that they attached themselves to noblemen of that time, wearing the badge of those noblemen as if they are working for them to avoid arrest and prosecution. So you have groups like the Lord Chamberlain's men, and the Lord Admiral's men. And Shakespeare belonged to the Lord Admiral's men at the time. They were also called King's men when King James came to the throne. Players were later accepted at court like the children of Paul's. The theatre was built in 1576 by James Burbage in Shoreditch, outside London. The theatre was built in 1576 by James Burbage in Shoreditch, outside London. Plays were acted at high speed without the act and scene breaks that we know today. Plays were acted at high speed without the act and scene breaks that we know today. There was no scenery and there were few props, but costumes were elaborate. The plays were performed in the afternoon. After all, there was no electricity. The building of the Globe Theatre took place in 1608. The Globe was built in 1608. How many years after the first theatre was built outside London? During Elizabethan's time, during Elizabethan time, boys played women's parts as apprentices. Women were not allowed to act, so boys played the roles of women. Elizabethan attitudes could be gleaned from its writers like Ben Jonson, who believed in classical principles of structure and decorum, the ideal of the centered self, and the balanced moral life. Elizabethan attitudes could be gleaned from its writers like Ben Jonson, who believed in classical principles of structure and decorum, the ideal of the centered self, and the balanced moral life. His emphasis upon learning and his reconciliation of classical and native life. His emphasis upon learning and his reconciliation of classical and native English elements in poetry and drama. Sidney was also personified in the Elizabethan Renaissance man. He was a courtier, a soldier, humanist soldier, scholar, Patriarchal sonneteer, literary critic, and an earnest supporter of the Protestant reforms. So, an individual like Philip Sidney embodied the zeitgeist of the age. You look at his character, look at his personality, and you see everything about the period reflected. He was everything in one: a gentleman, a courtier, a soldier, humanist scholar, a sonnet writer, literary critic, and a supporter of the Protestant reforms. The end of Elizabeth's reign foreshadowed the rift that would eventually plunge the nation into civil war during James' time. Note the beheading of the Earl of Essex in 1601 after mounting a failed rebellion in 1599, the year Spencer died. Queen Elizabeth was old and the hope of a peaceful succession was in doubt. The Queen died in 1603 and James VI of Scotland ascended the throne as James I of England. I take that again. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 and James VI of Scotland came to the throne as James I of England. That is where we end our class for today.